Thank you everyone for joining us at the inaugural WGEA webinar. We are intending for this to be a series, so stay tuned, follow us on socials and keep an eye on the mailing list to see what's going to come next. This webinar will be about writing a successful conference abstract, and we're very glad to have you all here today. We have 4 speakers here joining us today. Myself, Pauline Becker, I'm from Stanford Medicine, and all 4 of us are on the WGEA steering committee. And collectively, between the 4 of us, we have over a decade of experience reviewing WGEA abstract submissions. So I'm the communications chair of WGEA. We also have Mindy Ju here. Do you mind waving? Hi, Mindy. She's hailing from our neighbors at UCSF, and she's the member at large on the committee. Win May is also here from Keck School of Medicine at USC. Hi, Win. And she is the WGEA's UME representative on the steering committee. And finally, last but not least, we have Constance Tucker, who's hailing us from our WGEA 2022 host, Oregon Health and Science University, OHSU, and she is our measure chair. For those of us who don't know what measure stands for, I have it down here and I'm reading it. Medical Education, Scholarship, Research, and Evaluation. So Constance is our measure chair on the steering committee. I would like to invite all of you who are present to introduce yourselves and your institution in the chat. We'd love to have a conversation going. We are going to take questions at the end, but it would be great if you posted questions in the Q&A. That's going to be monitored by all the speakers as we go through the presentation, and Mindy will moderate a Q&A. We do have some time reserved at the end. Finally, Mindy's going to post the link to these slides in the chat. These slides do contain some links to resources and references, so you can follow along at home if you'd like via that link. We're going to start with a little bit of administration. I'm hoping that everyone present saw the call for proposals and has marked their calendar that WGEA 2022 is going to be March 31st to April 3rd of next year, tentatively taking place in person in Portland, Oregon, hosted by OHSU. And the theme for the conference has been announced as Bridging the Educational Continuum in Bridge City. For those of you who've been to Portland, know that it's a beautiful city full of bridges over the river. Along with the call for proposals is the important deadline. So the call for proposals is due November 15th. And in fact, for those of you who may be joining us from other regions, that call for proposals November 15th is the same for all of the regional spring meetings. So please be sure that you have your proposal ready and submitted by that date. And then the link for the WGEA is on this slide, but the links for submission to the other regional spring meetings was distributed in an email late last week. We're going to start off the content of today by getting to know all of you just a little bit better. So we'll be doing this through some poll everywhere questions. If you could please take out your devices and go to pollev.com/SOM-EdTech. That's School of Medicine EdTech. And this will help us make sure that we are speaking to what you're hoping to hear. So the first question is, what is your role? And I'll just wait a couple of seconds to see some answers roll in to see who we've got on the call here. All right, great. We've got some faculty, a lot of leadership, and a handful of staff. The next thing we'd like to know is, have you submitted to a GEA regional conference before? Oh, excellent. That's what we wanted to see. We wanted to see people who were new to this and make sure that what we were delivering today was of value. Great. The next question is, How confident are you in your ability to write a successful abstract? Because we're hoping to see, we're also going to ask this question at the end, and we're hoping to see a little bit of change in these numbers. So please be candid. These results are going to be completely anonymous. Your name will never be associated with what you answer here. All right. So we have some moderately unsures, which is great. That's why you're all here. Finally, I believe this is the last question. What are you hoping to hear about today? And this is an open response question. And once people start typing things in, you are able to vote up or vote down. So this one, I'll take a minute and sit on this one to allow things to come in. So themes or key issues. I'm assuming that, okay, common mistakes, that's a great one. Reviewer insights. We haven't framed our slides according to those, but I think we'll touch on all of these. I'll give it another minute for ideas to come in about what you're hoping to hear about today, and feel free and vote these up if these are things you're hoping to hear about as well. We specifically have a slide on reviewer criteria, so we will be talking about that. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughts. Oh, okay, and we have competitive abstract topics. That is not an area that we are planning to talk about, but it might be worth some discussion at the end. If you put that in your Q&A, maybe we could all touch upon that and talk about it. Okay. This is the last question. A plug for WGEA on social. Did you know that WGEA is on Twitter and Facebook? We'll provide our links at the end. But if you didn't know, I'd appreciate if you gave us a like or a follow when we show you the links at the end. Okay, now for the actual content. Oh, one more reminder, please leave that Poll EV window open because we will be revisiting Poll EV at the end for the webinar evaluation. All right, so step one, when the call for proposals goes out, read the call for proposals. We've provided the link in these slides, but one thing that you'll notice, and this is just the effect of having lots of people involved in planning these big events, you'll see that sometimes there's slight inconsistencies between the written call for proposals and the submission form and things that you see in different places. It's a little bit unavoidable, but I find that it's really, really helpful to read all the way through the call for proposals document, which is generally a PDF, but also to read through the submission form because there may be some additional information on the submission form. For example, word limits or phrasing of particular questions that you don't see on the call for proposals PDF. In my department, I create a template from the submission page prompts in the form. And that template I distribute to all of my colleagues, and it makes it easier for them to write their proposals. And finally, the first thing I do is I start gathering my data and references. I write a first draft. I pass that draft around to my colleagues, my husband, my friends. They catch things and they have good ideas. And I make sure that I leave enough time for this process to happen. And then finally, I submit on time, and I always check my my word counts. Oops. So this year for WGEA, and I can't speak to the call for all of the other regions, there are 3 submission types, and the basics about the submission types are here on these slides. Research and innovation are similar. They're both 300 word limit submissions. They both result in a 10-minute oral presentation at the conference. And they both have this series of sections that are required by the submission. Workshops is a little bit different. It requires a longer abstract submission, and it results in a 90-minute hands-on workshop. And the key word there is hands-on. These workshop submissions are not to be presentations the way this one is. They're really to be interactive between the speaker and the audience. And that is why in your submission, try and focus some thought and detail on what the session methods and format is going to be and how you're going to engage your audience. And now I'm going to hand it over to Constance.
Thanks. So I wanted to take a moment to just frame the discussion around what I think Laura Varpio did a really lovely job of talking about the persuasive power of writing and increasing the persuasive power of your written abstracts when thinking about conferences. And she uses this lovely framework of ethos, pathos, and logos. And so ethos being the credibility of the way in which you write up the work, pathos being the emotional interest connection that you have in your writing, and then logos being the logical side of your writing. So I'd like to walk us through a worked example of the structure of an abstract and how we see ethos, pathos, and logos show up in those abstracts. Because if you think about the amount of time the average, I mean, if I think about my own reviews, when I'm reviewing these abstracts, I read through fairly quickly, no more than 5 minutes before I'm making judgments about the credibility and emotional connection and logic of that abstract. And so how can we make a really succinct argument about the strength of an abstract by thinking about those very things? So we'll start with the title. So next slide. The title is a really interesting place to think about pathos, the emotional aspect of your work, and you want to arouse the interest of the reader. And what you see here in this example from Avery in 2012 was that a hollow promise is this kind of, ooh, I'm interested in reading more because what is the hollow promise? You want to pull the reader in with your language, and that's that pathos emotional connection. And at the same time, the title also addresses ethos, which is credibility. And the credibility comes from the use of key terms that connect theoretical frameworks and the actual content of the discussion. So this is a really great example in the title of both calling out pathos and ethos, the emotional and the credible. Next slide. In the intro, this is a great opportunity to also think about ethos, logos, and pathos. So I'm going to give you examples of each. So the ethos, the credibility, is in the description of what we know. And this is essentially, in this introduction, a 3-sentence introduction. The first sentence is your lit review sentence. And the second sentence is the identification of the gap, which is a logic discussion about logos. And then the third sentence, and maybe it has a little bit of logic and pathos, is the research question. And so you've done a complete introduction in 3 sentences targeting ethos, logos, and pathos. And I say pathos a little bit in that research question because they ask kind of an intriguing question, right? Which is self-reported humanitarian disposition an indicator of future performance in medical school and internship? And now you're pulling me in with both a logical argument, but also an emotional one. Next slide. In the methods section, I think we see really great examples in this particular piece of logos, which is that logical organization of reporting our methods and explaining what we did, but also some credibility. And I think it's important to call out that this is again about 3 sentences of a methods section. This section of the methods called out that they used a validated measure, and that increases the ethos, the credibility of your work. And it doesn't take many sentences to talk about it, but the language choice here I think was really helpful for me to say, oh, this is a credible submission. And then finally, in the data analysis, what kind of data analysis did you do? And can you summarize it clearly in 1 to 2 sentences? Next slide. Oh, yes, results. So this is a results section is usually mostly logical, and it should feel logical when we read it, probably at least 3 sentences, if not more. And there should be some inclusion of data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative in this section, that helps to show us the logical conclusion for the question that you asked earlier. And so no surprises here, but I do think this is a good example of how you can do this in a succinct way and still address the logic. And then finally, the last section, our conclusion, which is where we use both logos, where we started, the logic and kind of the statement and summary of our work, but also concluding with that pathos, the emotional connection that we started with. And so what I think, this particular submission did a good job of highlighting is that they use the language of the hollow promise in the last couple of words, which ties you all the way back to the title in which they talked about a hollow promise. And so that was the emotional kind of connection returning again. So I highlight this because I think as we're writing up abstracts, we do have to think differently about the emotional and logical and kind of credibility claims that we make in very succinct ways. And I think this is a great kind of frame to think about it in. I'll pause there and pass it over to Mindy.
Thanks, Constance. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper into each of the sections now. I'm going to be talking about mostly the introduction, and when we think about the introduction, and I think there was a great example that Constance gave of an introduction that in 3 sentences really got you engaged. One other way to think about this is the problem gap hook heuristic, which many of you might have already heard about or have read this article by Lorelei Lingard. And so she uses the analogy of academic writing as really joining an ongoing conversation. So making that analogy that you're at a dinner party and you're walking over and you are joining a small group that's already in the process of talking about their last trip to Italy. I don't know, I'm choosing something random. And so you don't want to just jump in without really knowing anything about the topic or setting the stage, saying like you've heard what's been going on in the conversation. You want to spend some time listening and then sort of insert yourself into that, giving people the impression or making people feel that you have been listening and to the ongoing conversation and that you have something valuable to add. And so when we think about problem gap hook, we think about the problem being something in the world that people are talking about. And frequently for us as educators, it is something we notice in our clinical setting or our environment that we recognize as a problem. And so that's sort of where we start a lot of our research work. And so this is the problem that we want to address. The gap is the gap in the current knowledge or thinking about a problem, which is very analogous to how we write clinical research papers or bench science papers. And the hook, I would say, is how we convince the reader that this is important. And so going back to Constance's pathos or ethos, pathos, logos, I would say the hook is really getting at the emotion of the reader and trying to say, this is important because of X, Y, and Z, or this study is going to add to the conversation because of X, Y, and Z. So hopefully I'm going to go through, you can go ahead, Pauline, you're excellent timing. Going to go through an example that actually Lorelei Lingard lays out in her, so I stole this, but I cited her, so it's all good. And just to highlight the difference in how these 2 introductions are written. And again, very dense introductions with 3 sentences that captures what you're trying to get across. And this is perfect for abstracts. Obviously, this problem gap hook also applies to your manuscripts, but more detail is generally provided. But on the left-hand side, you'll see leadership is increasingly recognized as an important competency for physicians. At the same time, collaboration is growing as a value and expectation of health delivery. And so there's not really a problem in there. We can infer what a problem might be from what that's, but it's really just labeling it as a topic. Like I'm studying fast ligand receptors and stop, not really identifying what the problem is. And then if we then look to the right side, this is how it's written in this side really captures the problem that we're addressing or trying to address. leadership and collaboration are highly valued and potentially conflicting competencies in the medical practice. So there, it's very clear what the problem is that we have these two things that are very important and valuable in medical education, medical practice, yet they don't always align. So there you have the problem or the conflict. Then the green highlighted section is similar in both, which is just highlighting the gap in the literature. Very similar again to when we write clinical research or bench science research, which some people might be more used to reading because of how we are raised in medical education. So highlighting the gap. And then finally, the last section, in a traditional research paper or a clinical bench science research paper, it might just say what the purpose of the study is or what the question, the research question that's trying to be answered. Does this protein increase the uptake of whatever molecule? Whereas in medical education, we really are trying to get at the, am I saying the right one? Ethos, the feeling? Yes, Constance, okay. With trying to say, what is the hook? Why should I care? And so in this one, we can say with physicians experiencing increasing formal expectations that they will lead and collaborate effectively, we require systematic knowledge about how these companies play out in clinical teams. And so we can say, oh, this is important because our trainees are going to have to learn how to both lead and collaborate. And so we need to understand how that's happening in real life so we can better prepare them for these competencies. So just reading the left versus the right really sets the tone for I've been listening to the conversation. I know what's happening in this field. And I'm adding something to it. And it's not just a study because I wanted to publish something. It's a study because I think it's going to have consequence in the long run. So the introduction is also a place, and in the methods, it depends where you can put this, and probably in our going over what reviewers are actually looking at, the scorecard, it might delineate where more of this should lie, but framing your work with a framework. So we really want to ground the work in the literature. And so again, a lot of this probably should have been thought out while you were designing the study. But we're talking about when you're writing the abstract. So this stuff applies to other aspects of the research. But particularly in an abstract, you might think, well, I have limited amount of space. Maybe I don't want to mention this, but just one sentence, a few words about what framework you use can really help the abstract reader and reviewer understand what your research is about, because then it's a quick sign of like, well, this is the field that they're looking into, and also sends the message that you have an understanding of what the discussion in the literature has been about a certain topic. So we can talk about how frameworks are amazing when you're developing your research projects to help guide your research methodology, methods, and et cetera, et cetera. But in this context, it's really important because it just signals to the reviewer that you have an understanding of what's going on, and then also helps us understand in very few words, perhaps how you went about your research. And so in research, there's theoretical frameworks, which there are a bajillion out of, and that's like probably, you could do a whole PhD and try and learn all the educational theory out there. And in innovation, frequently it's a design framework. So how did you go about designing your curriculum? For instance, Current 6 Steps, that is a wonderful framework for curriculum design that if you just put that in there, everyone knows sort of the steps that you went through and it provides the pathos, yes, to your research. Next. I think that's me, and I think I'm handing it over to Wynn.
Thank you. Now we're going to be talking about methods, and you might notice that there is some redundancy in our presentation, and that's because we've realized that there are so many different kinds of learners with different learning styles, and we're hoping that this will cater to all the different learning styles that are there. So if you're looking at a research abstract, I want you to think about where the research took place. Who were the participants and why were they chosen? You might want to also talk about the concepts and the variables, because the concepts are the mental images, and they tend to be more, they're more at the very high generality level. So you want to make sure that you can measure them. And to measure them, you go down to the variables, because the variables are measurable. So for example, if you're thinking of like effectiveness, which is more of a concept, then you want to think about how you're going to measure this. And the variables could be, how many times the person goes to, if it's an effective counseling, how many times the patient goes to the counseling? Is there any reduction in the days that they are taking time off, and so on? So you want to look at something that's more measurable, and that would be the variables. Then when you think of data collection, you would think of what kind of data will help you provide the best evidence to answer the question, because both Constance and Mindy talked about the problem and the question. So think about what data would provide you the best evidence to solve the problem or answer the question. And in so doing, you can think about whether you're thinking of a quantitative variable or a categorical variable. Where the quantitative, you can measure it like height, weight, so on. And the qualitative or the categorical is more qualitative. Once you think of what methods you'd use for data collection, then you're going to think of how you would analyze it. And the analysis would depend a lot on the methods that you use. For example, if you have used a quantitative method, it'll be more a statistical analysis or a meta-analysis. Whereas if you're looking at more of a qualitative, you'll be looking at themes when you're looking at the approach. Now, when we come to innovation and innovation abstract, as the name states, you want to say why you chose this method of innovation. So you might want to be looking at what was there before, and that's where, as Mindy and Constance talked about, what's the literature, what has been there before, and why you chose to innovate this. Who else was involved besides you in the innovation? And most importantly, you want to describe what was new or what was innovative. And with any innovation, you're going to need resources. So you would want to include what resources are needed. And then what assessment methods will you use? If it's a curriculum, what would you use to determine that this curriculum was effective? This innovative curriculum was effective. And with all innovations, there are always initial difficulties. All of us have experienced that whenever we try something new. So what were the initial difficulties, and what did you do to overcome those difficulties? Because that's going to be helpful to whoever wants to replicate your data, replicate your innovation. Then we come to workshops, which is a totally different animal. There you also need to think about who's the target audience, who are you aiming this workshop for? And the cardinal rule in all workshops is that you want to have less presentation and more activities. So you can do either small group exercises as well as large group exercises, and you all know different small group exercises that could be used. Remember to give handouts and worksheets, because people always appreciate them and they want to take those away with them when they go away. And then think of what are the deliverables of your workshop, so that when the person goes away from this workshop, they leave with something tangible and they're happy. Next, please. Thank you. It's important to back up your claims. Whether you're doing research or whether you're doing innovations, you want to design a strong evaluation. You want to make sure that there are no threats to the study's validity. Then you're going to provide your data, and it could be assessment data, it could be evaluation data, it could be research data. And you want to describe the data that you've been either able to produce or to process. And be specific when you write the results, because you want to make sure that whoever's reading it, the reviewer who's reading it, the audience, whoever's reading it, knows that the results are very specific and that they answer the question. Remember when Mindy said, at the end, did it answer the question? And Constance said that as well. And so it'll be either the question that answers the research question or that evaluates the innovation. So those would be important to include for your results. And if it's human subjects research, then it's good to include your IRB approval, because as you know, you need IRB approval if you're going to disseminate, and this is one form of dissemination. You'll want to include references if you can, because that's going to show that you've grounded your design, whether it's research or whether it's innovation, in whatever literature that already exists. Next, please. Conclusion. This is also important for both research and innovation submission types. You want to make sure that the research that the conclusion, in the conclusion, it talks about the answer to your question. So sometimes people restate the problem saying, so we looked at this problem and this is what we found. And that makes the audience realize, oh yeah, they did think about that, and that's what they're doing. If there's an impact, please be sure to mention the impact. What is the impact of your study? What is the impact of your innovation? What were some of the implications behind the innovation that you did? Would like you to avoid speculation. You're not gonna, and that's sometimes we do it, I do it, I've done it, and I have to be careful. You find a correlation and then you kind of imply that it's a causation. It's not. So you don't want to speculate on something that you didn't find. You want to make sure that you're talking about your limitations, because if people want to further the research or the innovation that you've done, unless they know what the limitations were, they won't be able to progress further. You want to talk about transferability or generalizability. If it's a quantitative research, it'll be generalizability. If it's qualitative, it's going to be more of transferability. What lessons did you learn? Please let everybody know so that they will not make the same mistakes. And when you mention future directions, you're going to look at both the limitations as well as the lessons that were learned. Thank you. And I hand it back to Pauline.
All right, so I'm going to be talking just a little bit about grammar tips. In general, please use the active voice when you're writing your conference abstract. So for example, instead of "it was found that," say "we found that." Instead of "the data was analyzed by," say "we analyzed the data." One of the pitfalls of writing a sentence like "the data was analyzed by" is that then you can sometimes end up in the third person. That sentence may end, "the data was analyzed by the research team." It would be better to say, "we analyzed this data," and use the first person. So instead of "the research team used this method," you can say "we use this method." And finally, be consistent. Whatever style you choose, however you decide to spell things, or because sometimes there are different spellings of various acronyms, just make sure that you're consistent so that when someone sees something at one point in the abstract and at the second point in the abstract, it sounds the same and it looks the same to your reviewer. Finally, copy edit, copy edit, copy edit. I think I mentioned this before, but ask your colleagues to review your draft, ask your partners, ask your kids, ask your friends. If your best friend who is not a part of the field can't understand something in the draft, If you have a reviewer who happens to be in a different field, chances are they might not be able to understand your draft either. So having outside people read your draft is always a good idea. Reading your draft aloud is an incredible tool. It sounds absolutely ridiculous, and it feels a little bit foolish to be sitting at your computer and reading something out loud, but you would not believe the mistakes that you end up catching because you read something aloud. You realize phrasing is awkward. You realize you've duplicated the word the 3 times, just silly typos you see when you read things aloud. So we strongly suggest you read your drafts aloud. And finally, please do stick to your word count limits. Your friendly neighborhood reviewers will thank you for it. Now I'm going to hand it back to Constance, who's going to talk a little bit about the criteria that reviewers use.
So I think it's always helpful because sometimes we write thinking of the reviewers in mind, but we don't quite know what the reviewers are looking for when they're reading the work. For you all to see what essentially is the rubric that we've used in the past when looking at the abstracts. And so at the bottom, you see that the reviewers have usually a rating from 1 to 5. And 1 being an absence of seeing that particular item at all the way up to an excellent presentation of that particular item. So for each of the areas on the slide, the introduction, the interest, the learning objectives, the strength of the background, the methods and the relevance of outcomes, as well as the conclusion, the reviewer is making a ranking of 1 to 5. And so I think it's important to note that if you look at your abstract and you realize that you did not address one of these sections, maybe something like clarity of learning objectives, right? If you're doing an innovative workshop, if you didn't call out the objectives, that you would get a 1 in that case. And so it would be really important to go back and say, oh, let me really call out, and usually with an explicit header, you're kind of putting these in boxes when you submit, right? So you'd want to make sure that you were consistent, that the box that said learning objectives really had learning objectives explicitly called out in it. The same thing is true of, I think Mindy talked about the strength of the background. In that box, we're looking for a theoretical framework of some sort. A framework of any kind is acceptable, as long as it's related to the work and you can support it in the way that you've set up your methods and analysis. And so making sure that you're going through and identifying, can the raters, number 1, find these items in my abstract? And then number 2, that gives you kind of the 3-level work, right? Which is that you submitted something. What if you submitted something that's a decent fit for the approach that you use? Did you also integrate it and kind of explain why it's a valid and credible approach to your work? So not a lot of details here, but I would just say as a reviewer from the other end, we are being fairly explicit with the rubric about what we're looking for and making sure that you check those boxes in your final review to make sure that you've addressed each of these. Thanks. Next slide.
All right, so we had asked you to please keep your Poll Everywhere window open. That concludes the formal content of that we're delivering today of our webinar. We would love for you to go back to Poll Everywhere. It's a quick 6-question evaluation. One of the questions is, what would you like to hear from us in our next webinar? And one is the same question we had at the beginning on how confident you feel in submitting a successful abstract. We'd really appreciate your responses, and your name, of course, your name and information will never be shared.
While people are filling that out. Oh, sorry, you have another slide. I interrupted.
I have a couple more. I think a couple more. Here are the links that we talked about for Facebook and Twitter. If you would like to hear about news about WGEA member schools, about what the opportunities within the WGEA or AAMC, they're communicated through these socials. So please hop online and like and follow us. folks from all regions are welcome, of course. We do work across regions with other regional GEA groups to share information and resources. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think Mindy has the link to these slides. So Mindy, if you could post those in the chat, which it looks like you already did, you can flip through those slides and just click directly from the slides, so you don't have to copy this link. Finally, we want to make sure we practice with what we preach and we stand behind our claims. Here are the references that we use in this presentation. Again, links are in the slide. And I believe that's my final slide, handing it back over to Mindy.
So thank you so much for joining. And I think we can open up the Q&A, but while people are filling out the evaluation and maybe thinking of questions, I thought we could answer some of the questions that came up in the initial, what are you hoping to get out of this? And so I would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on most common mistakes or pitfalls that people see when they're reviewing abstracts. I know some of them were mentioned, and I will start off that I not infrequently read abstracts that look like they are copy pasted from proposals. So really read, that is when reading out loud helps. So proposals are future tense, we will do this. Abstracts are, we have done this. So just be generous. I know we're all constrained for time, and you know it's easy to, you think, oh, this abstract's due in 30 minutes, I'm just going to pop these things in, but take the time because it takes away from the credibility of your work. That's one thing that I've seen more than once.
One thing I would say, which I think Wynn alluded to, is be transparent about the mistakes that you made and the gaps that might be present in what you've accomplished to date. A lot of you will probably be writing these abstracts in the very middle of a research project or at the beginning of an innovation project and not have the results yet and not quite know where things are going. That is absolutely okay, as long as you acknowledge the fact that that's where you are and that those are the limitations.
I'll add one specific to workshops. The discussion around workshops really is about engagement often, and whether someone has set up the session in a way that's meaningful for discussion and for co-creation of knowledge and information. And so I would say that feels like the thread that goes through every workshop proposal. It could be a great idea, but if someone just lectures to participants and has written a really strong proposal without interactivity, I think it really would struggle to make it through. And then I do think that we are looking with a lens of pathos, like the emotional portion and the connection and interest. We're trying to put on a conference that we hope people will be engaged and interested in all of the sessions. And so while you may have done a really rigorous study, if it lacks the interest level, then we often are wondering, like, okay, well, what can we pair with that might be interesting? Is there another session that would pull people in that this might go with? And so I think the interest piece, while it shouldn't be the only thing, particularly in this context of conference organization for abstracts, we are definitely interested in that pathos, the interest.
That's a great segue to one other topic that came up in the beginning, which was what are some appealing, I can't remember the exact word, but exciting, appealing abstract topics. And so, and that goes to the pathos. So any thoughts, Constance, Wynn, or Pauline, about, and I know that sometimes there's specific calls to certain things that we are looking for, but Pauline.
My initial thought is, what was your school's reaction to COVID? And that could span so many different areas. What were the educational innovations that happened? What were the technological innovations that happened? What were policy innovations that happened? How did you handle high stakes testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's so many questions. And whatever it is that your institution did, you almost certainly learn something that would be of value to another institution.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of one that's very like time specific. I would say some of the threads that I've seen over the last couple of years that have been truly kind of consistent have been integration of the continuum of education. So if you're able to integrate UME, GME, CME in your abstract and proposal, we start to see alignment between, oh, that really appeals to a lot more participants at the conference. And so that longitudinal approach to integration across the curriculum is really a successful one. I would also say IPE initiatives have been, IPE and simulation are often spaces of which we see appeal to a larger group of people because they can think about the way in which the information is transferable. And so I would say those are other areas that in non-COVID years, I would say still have strong appeal.
To reflect further on Constance's comment about bridging the continuum, think about whatever the conference is, there's almost always a theme. So the theme for this particular conference is bridging the continuum. See if you can come up with an idea that addresses that theme.
And now many of you, oh, sorry, Wynn, go ahead.
It's okay. I was thinking nowadays, people are thinking a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that is also a competitive abstract that you might want to think about, because all schools are doing that, as you said earlier, with regard to like COVID also, this is something that all schools are doing, so embarking on. And I think people are always interested to learn about what your school is doing, which is something that they could also emulate.
And just to build off the idea of the continuum, your research might be on using like trainings in neuropathology, which is very niche, but there's probably some aspect to what you are researching that can be applicable across multiple specialties or the continuum. And so just highlighting that even in just a few words or sentence that in your abstract can be helpful, because we might read something and be like, this is very niche and not going to apply to a wide range of people. But if you can point us to the direction, it can be helpful. I have two questions that showed up in our Q&A, and we have 12 minutes left. So the first one I'm gonna do is Tim Baker, hello, chair of the WGEA steering committee. Do you have any suggestions for how to get help from others with expertise in this area? Is there a way to do pre-submission review with those who can help improve the quality of an abstract, improve chances of acceptance? I have an answer to that. I host works in progress in our Department of Pediatrics. You don't have to be a pediatrician to join, and we are very open and can be outside of UCSF as well. If you're interested in getting some feedback, our group is always open to people. So just, you can reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat. I know that's a very specific situation, but that is one option, recognizing that some institutions might not have as much support in this regard.
We have an Innovations in Medical Education conference every February, and there you can not only submit the completed research, but also works in progress. So and you can submit and you get feedback from, if you're not accepted, you get feedback, and if you're accepted, you also get feedback so that you can improve your submission.
We have a second question, from Laura Rubinos from UCSF Pediatrics. If we are thinking about submitting a workshop, are there any additional things to keep in mind, i.e. typical target audience, advanced registration for small group planning, typical participant group size, etc.?
I can
workshops.
start. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Constance, it's fine.
Well, no, I think I don't know that I've actually had the experience of knowing exactly what our audience looks like each time, which is why that that comment about the longitudinal piece becomes so important. And I think the pathos piece, the connection and interest piece becomes so important for the WGEA, because we're a bit of an eclectic bunch in the sense that we're all medical educators or health professions educators in some cases. But our interests and kind of the sessions that we choose to go to may or may not be aligned with the work that we do. So while you might have an associate dean, or I'm a vice provost, but then you have a scholarship person, we might all be in the same session about wellness. So I would say, unfortunately, there's not a typical audience because we don't know who's going to attend the session, and therefore we intentionally try to be broad in our base rather than specific. That's kind of avoiding your question, but that would be my response.
I have a comment about workshops. One thing that I have always really appreciated in workshop submissions, say that 5 times fast, is the forethought put into what the deliverable is going to be. Not just for the conference, but for the participants. So some workshops explicitly call out, at the end of this workshop, we will be able to deliver to the participants X, whether it's the result of a survey, whether it's a write-up of the brainstorm, whether it's a worksheet that the participants have filled out and can walk away with and use as a template at their institutions, like Lynn mentioned. But whatever that deliverable is, that thing that participants can walk away with, that adds a lot of value.
And I would just like to add that, we've looked at, when I'm reviewing workshops, I get very upset when I don't see, or when I see very few activities and a lot of didactics being delivered, and that would not make for a successful workshop. And I think it's a little different when you're having a workshop. When you talk about numbers, if you're doing a workshop virtually, it's different than if you're doing a workshop live. When you're doing a workshop virtually, it's harder to have a larger group for the small group. So I don't like to have more than 6 to 7 people if it's a virtual workshop, because it's very difficult and you have to find enough facilitators for each of the groups. Whereas if you're doing it live, you can increase it up to 10 to 15 people, and then you can do it with, and then have that number of facilitators. So I would say, I always like to review those workshops which have the times. They say, okay, first 5 minutes, this, next 5 minutes is this. So it makes whoever's reviewing the workshop knows exactly what you'll be doing and what activities you'll be doing, what worksheets you're going to be using. So make it as detailed as you can, and that'll make it much easier for us to review. Thank you.
To express my lack of knowledge, even though I've reviewed workshops, I cannot remember, and maybe you all remember, and this sort of builds off the question that Tim has posted, when we're in person, are there limits to the number? I can't remember if you pre-register for workshops. I don't believe you just walk in and then at some point you say, there aren't enough seats left at the table. Is that correct? And then in virtual, have we been putting limits on? So I see a very adamant no from Pauline.
Not in virtual. I think just whoever shows up in the Zoom room ends up showing up in the Zoom, as far as I know. But Tim, please comment in the chat if we're wrong.
So I hope that answers Laura's question, because I think she wants to make sure she's, describing a workshop that she can actually pull off with the number of people that we are expecting. But again, it's random. It depends. Probably you might have 2, you might have 25, it sounds like.
That's true.
A lot also depends on when you get scheduled. A lot of the last day sessions are more lightly attended because folks have already started going home. You just never know how many people are going to show up.
Yeah.
And then maybe to more explicitly answer Tim's question, and I think that will be the close us out, is there anything you would modify for virtual versus in-person conferences?
I'm thinking.
For workshops, definitely. Teaching a workshop virtually is going to be different than in person. And I think Wynn already touched upon this. In my experience doing workshops virtually, smaller groups, so you might need to think about, you're going to need more facilitators for the virtual workshop than in person. And there are just certain activities that you cannot do virtually, or you have to adjust. So
I think from my point of view, if you're planning an in-person workshop, there's something about physical collateral, like pieces of paper. I know that paper is awful, but the favorite workshops that I've attended have used physical things to enable the discussion, whether it be note cards that people were taking notes on, to worksheets that people were filling out with pen and paper. All of those things could be done digitally. But in putting the thought behind what you could have as physical collateral in the workshop, that helps make your thinking very clear about how you're going to spend your time, and what the learning objectives are and what you're going to end up having the folks walk away with.
maybe that's a future webinar, giving workshops virtually, although we're a year and a half in, so hopefully people have figured out all the different, annotate and etc. to engage your speakers, or your participants. But that could be a whole other webinar.
And just to be explicit, as far as we know to this date, WGEA 2022 will be in person in Portland, Oregon, which we're all excited about.
I'm ready for really good, not expensive coffee. That is my experience of Portland.
I am ready for my
I
next.
got a cup of coffee. I was like, $3.
I'm ready for my trip to Powell's. Well, everyone, it's 12:58. I haven't seen any more questions come in, and the chat has slowed down a little bit. Should we close things out? All right, Wynn, Mindy, Constance, thank you so much for presenting today. For the attendees, thank you so much for joining. And if you haven't already, please let us know what you think at the evaluation on the link on this slide. And we will see you all next time.